One, thank you so much for coming to check out the StashCast, where we have interesting conversations with interesting people focused on the world of commercial real estate and the world of PropTech. The StashCast is brought to you by Needle. What if you could use data and analytics to predict which transactions were going to occur? You can with Needle. Check it out at Needle, NEDL.us to learn more. All right, today we have a very special guest, Deborah Smith, with us today, and I'm really excited to have you. Deborah, if you could maybe give the audience a little bit about who you are and what you do, that would be great.
Sure. Thanks for having me on, Stash. I look forward to the conversation. So I am Deborah Smith. I'm co-founder, CEO of the StashCast Group. We are a boutique investment bank focused entirely on the real estate sector. We buy and sell companies. We raise capital for projects and for investment vehicles. And we have a materially large consulting practice that advises on anything from succession planning to valuation, product development, and how to grow your business. A common question we get right now is, in a tough transaction environment, is how do we go from 2 billion to 5 billion? And what are we going to do to get there? And what are we going to do corporately, either organizationally, operationally, in order to make changes to make sure we're ready in order to keep growing? So that's the day-to-day of which I do. We've been around since 2009. Rightly or wrongly, we as a women-owned firm decided it was an idea to open an investment bank in the middle of the GFC, and the rest is history. Either smart or stupid, the jury's still out on that, but we are still around and still having fun.
That's amazing.
Crazy, Stash. It's crazy. It's crazy. Nobody does that.
I got my start in February of 08 when I got my first real estate license. And it was like, hey guys, I'm here. And they're like, oh, the party's over. We're all hung up. And so that was a fun way to slog through a couple of years. But yeah.
Yeah, it was interesting. We prior to starting the StashCast Group, I was co-head of CBRE, their investment management business, their global M&A business. And it was a really crazy time back coming into the GFC. You had the heights of 07 and we come into 08, and in the mornings we were putting out fires and trying to rescue different parts of what was going on across the firm. And in the afternoons, we had raised the largest, I think, value add vehicle that year. And so the afternoon job was figuring out how to deploy it. It was definitely a very crazy time to be in the real estate space for sure.
Yeah, there were a lot of fortunes made from then until now. But there's still some people. I remember back in like 2014, I was talking to a prospect and he later became a client, but I think that the prices are just too high. I'm gonna sit and wait for him to come back down again. And he hasn't gotten back into the market since. So I wish him the best.
Look, I think over a 15-year span, with interest rates being where they were and money was free, it really fed a frenzy across the real estate industry. And it's not always easy to see when you're in it, and it's there in your face every single day. And cap rates at 3%, 3.5%, 4%, but where the cost of debt where it was, I think people just got used to that's where the world was and that's how it operated. And we've got a correction back. And I think there's still a lot of things that need to happen, and the correction is still very much in play. But as with the beauty of real estate is that there are always winners and losers. There's always ups and downs. And so with one thing correcting, another thing is doing really well. And throughout COVID through to now, there's been a lot of changes of preference of sectors and niches. It's been the rise of the niche, the rise of the vertical integration. So there's a lot of really cool, interesting trends that are absolutely happening that has continued to feed the industry if you've been smart enough to see it.
Yeah. So what are some of the trends that you're seeing on your end from your perspective?
I think an easy one there's two. So we can talk about PropTech in a second, because I think it is super cool, some of the things that are going on in that space. But before I do, I think one bucket that is very near and dear to us right now is what is going on the property management side of us. And part of that lies into technology too. Property management used to be and still is considered by many as a commodity. It's a commoditized product. It has thin margins. People haven't paid as much credit or value to it. I think that view is definitely changing. And in part of it, it's because of the rise of vertical integration. And I also think it's people see the value in having that hands on the ground, local market knowledge, getting access, because we all know that it's truly a local market business. But I think what's really making an industry is the role of technology. And we've got a situation now where you have two worlds. You have the world that says property management, you have people, it's physical, you need to be at the property, and that's where your thin margins and where in some ways your commodity products come from. On the other hand, we worked with a company, Common Living, last year that merged with Habit and became the largest co-living operator in the world. And their technology systems were really amazing and very advanced, but took the concept of centralization to anywhere further than anyone I think has seen in our space. And so where do you come in on that spectrum? Because the more you can centralize, in some ways leads to greater operational synergies as you need less people, but you still need people on the ground because it is still local market business and people still want to be face to face. So getting that balance right, I think the industry is trying to figure that out. And I think behind the scenes, we're seeing a lot of movement around this and I think it results in you're having some consolidation trends at the high end, but the merge of the newer companies coming up saying we can do it a new and better way.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I've noticed a shift. So there's a couple of things that were running through my mind as you were speaking. I've noticed commercial real estate in general is when I first got in, it was STP, see the property, see the people. And I think that still holds true, but there's a difference, I think, in kind of the old guard of, oh, my grandfather, great grandfather started this business and we haven't really changed since then, as opposed to some of the newer folks coming up. They are recognizing and leveraging technology to their benefit. Even I was touring a property today and the packages were just strewn about in the lobby. And I was like, this place needs a package system. Like that would be an easy value add, I think.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I right now there's plenty of managers that are very focused. It's a local market. And you got to have people in the buildings. You got to have them interface with residents, interface with leasing, etc. But there's a lot of functions that go into property management, right? And what we found through our common experience is the question really starts with what if we could centralize everything? What if we could centralize leasing? What if we could centralize maintenance? Start thinking through these functions of what is possible and not what actually is. It changes the dynamics and how you look at the world. And then the question becomes if you put it in front of a bunch of tech people, it's like, now you give me the what if, I will come up with a solution for you because that's what I do. I can centralize, that's what I do. And getting there, I think it's a combination of both worlds, but the balance is it's still an interesting balance. And I think if you take it through its next iteration, it's then you've got to ask yourself, with the folks that are really big, the bigger guys in property management in whatever space, how do they adjust? How do they accommodate for change? It's like the American Airlines versus Southwest, right? It's very hard and expensive to adjust older companies, bigger companies that have a certain way of doing things and they're entrenched versus someone new, the JetBlues, the Southwest, that can come out and say, hang on a second, let's start afresh and let's take a different way and a new way of looking at things. And so I think it'll be interesting as the interplay goes forward here as to how those two strike a balance. But the end result for sure is that we are seeing consolidation across the industry in the management space. Whereas 10 years ago, I'm not sure how many people paid attention to it, but now they're paying attention. And so I think there is definitely a lot of interest in what is going on the management side.
Yeah, I agree with what you're saying about how property management has been looked at as a commodity previously, but there is a gap, a true gap, and that widens seemingly as the days go by between good managers and not great managers. And third-party property management, if we're just talking about, that's a thankless task because you've got the ownership on one side and they're like maximum cash flow or deliver returns. And you've got the tenants on the other side and they're like, what about whatever it is, my maintenance request, my, security of the building, package security, things like that. Why is my rental rate going up? And you're stuck in the middle trying to make a margin in between. And it's really tough. It's a really tough business.
And the question is then, is which of all those things you later do I really need a person for? Versus, can I address a lot of it with a supercharged AI that can do routing behind the scene to try and satisfy a lot of those requests first? And we see it all the time now where we have the AI, the chat boxes, and a lot of times I can't stand them. They never seem to be able to have the answer to any of the questions I want. But that is only a matter of time until we have the systems in place and the technology is advanced enough that we can have AI generation that can replicate humans. I'm not sure we're that far off from getting to that place if it's machine learned.
Yeah, I agree. I use ChatGPT, and you've got Gemini from Google, and there's another
There's a
couple.
lot.
Yeah,
There's
there's
a
a
lot.
couple others out there, but you ask a very specific question and they're not yet able to deliver the exact specific answer you want, unless it's just something super simple. What year was this property built, for instance?
Mhm.
But they are coming, and I do think that there is a possibility for them to replace or augment what the people on the ground
Correct.
are doing.
Yeah. And let's just chat about the second trend just on prop tech, because that
Yeah,
plays right into that as well. Is I think we're seeing prop tech, and there's even funds, a lot of funds now focused on supporting prop tech companies. And
yeah,
we're definitely seeing the emergence of that now as well. But one of the areas that I'm really interested in is 3D printing. I really enjoy how the space is evolving. I personally, for me, think it is going to be a very material way into how we address housing going forward into the future. And I think we have the tools and the technology is here. I'm not sure we're quite at a place where we can do it in scale, but there's certainly a number of players that are out there that have the systems and the technology in place to start chipping away at it. And we first wrote about it in 21 or 22 as a total redoing of the manufactured housing sector. That's what it is. It's taking manufactured housing and giving it a look, a once over, and improving it, and taking something where you can create in a factory in pieces and with a guy with a clipboard. And why don't we replace that guy with the clipboard with a machine that can print these things and print it and have it delivered with minimal waste at a much lower cost that can be hurricane proof and would be a real value add for places like Fort Myers, which just gone through the hurricanes in Florida, to be able to come up with something that can be provided at a cost that the missing middle can afford without having worry about flooding or getting knocked over in a hurricane. I think there's really something to it and is definitely worth the effort and continuing to explore it.
yeah, that's fascinating. I like the idea of modular housing, have it built in a factory, even better
Yeah.
built on site. But I'm curious, what is your definition of prop tech? Because it seems to be roundabout. How do you think about it?
Yeah, I look at prop tech as using technology to support and improve the operations of what we're doing in the real estate sector.
Okay.
And so it can be defined quite broadly. It can be looking at replacing a person on doing background checks. It could be look at, as I've just described, instead of using people to build houses, to use machines to build houses, which
Hmm.
is only possible through advanced systems and software to be able to do that. And I think and a little back where we started on this conversation, the greatest challenge in some ways we have to prop tech is that we're so used to this industry doing it ourselves. It's done with a person. When we moved out to Stanford, our offices, we had to use a paper lease and carry them over to our landlord, who's a Class A public company. That's crazy to me. We're still using paper leases. But it's finding ways to create efficiencies without having to rely on a human to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's, I think before we started the episode, you were talking about that, the role of prop tech and the apprehension of commercial real estate to adopt it.
Yes. But I think you're right too. The point you had said is that we're getting generational changes. When I first come into this industry, I don't know, nearly 20 years ago, it's you didn't have to go far to see the person who built it or their child who's now running because someone else built it. And in many other industries, it's employees. The founders are long gone. But
Right.
real estate is such a regenerative industry. It's so full of creative entrepreneurs. And I think over time, we're seeing that generational change, which is probably why we're doing a lot of succession planning. We're seeing those generational changes. And the next generation is increasingly so, it's not overnight, I have more forward thinking, and we're raised in a social media world. We're raised where I should be able to rent an apartment over the internet. I should be able to. Manaport has replaced needing to do on-site tours. There are companies you can have the technology where you can rent an apartment without never speaking to a human being and getting into that apartment in a few days. That's what I call advancement in PropTech.
Yeah.
And I think that's all here. And it's just a question of willingness for the industry to accept it. And I think in part that's because there's still a wealth of folks that still want that personal contact as a tenant, but there's an increasing number of folks that never really do want to talk to a person. They're perfectly happy doing it online. And if anything, COVID sped up that process of folks relying on technology to do things that required in person before, including me and you talking today.
I was just thinking the same thing. Absolutely. We had Microsoft Teams as a firm for 2 years before COVID hit, and then nobody used it. And then all
Yeah,
of a sudden COVID hit and we were on it every single day, all the time. So
every day. And advances 5G and advances in how well Teams works. And there's like Google Meet and WebEx and Zoom and
yeah.
all these other programs now. But there are such advances in these systems that COVID helped elevate to a new place. And I think it's once you get into using these systems, it's hard to walk it back because I think at the end of the day, people prefer and favor convenience.
Yeah.
It's my number one
100%.
thing, yes, coming out of COVID, is that when I look at what do we think is going to happen coming out of COVID with different trends, is you don't have to look further than the consumer and their preference for convenience. And when you start looking at it from that perspective, you start looking, I think, at many things very differently.
Yeah, I think you're right. COVID definitely highlighted that, I think to an extent, much more than anybody realized, was that preference for convenience. And Amazon obviously has taken advantage of that. Huh, that's fascinating. Very
Yeah,
interesting.
just think about this. So during COVID, we had a couple of million people moved down to the south. And so what does that mean? It's like all of those people, if we layer in the convenience factor. So those people need somewhere to live, we all agree. They need to go somewhere to shop, and which we can agree. And that just doesn't have to be supermarket. It can be going to a sporting goods store or whatever. But if you think through just those basic mechanics, it changes the whole industrial sector because you need last mile logistics. I need cold storage, right? iOS, to think through the spaces that are very hot right now.
Mhm.
Industrial outdoor storage, iOS. Cold storage is another one that's very hot. Self storage is another one that's very hot. These sectors have been beneficiary because as people have moved, and you tie in the fact that people want everything yesterday, that it's really pushed the revamping of various parts of the real estate sector. So while we can agree office has struggled, we can all agree that hotel has struggled at times, but then the rest, then you've got all these other sectors that are doing really well and are still very expensive. And there's a huge amount of interest in, driven out of COVID and a shift in demographics and this preference for convenience.
Yeah. And what's interesting, I've got teenagers, they're 15, and they still wanted to spend their free weekend at the mall, basically. Yeah, exactly. They're still doing that, which is a timeless thing. But we have one predominant mall here in Cincinnati, whereas we used to have five or six. And I think what COVID and the rest of maybe prop tech and how the shifting of the economy has really bolstered that one node and has forced everything else to reinvent itself because they're still in good spots. They just need to figure out a new thing to do. It's not going to be a shopping district.
Yeah. And I think if you take that, just given where we are now, is that we all talk about whether we can redesign real estate and whether we can rehab real estate and take something and turn it into something else. And as we've come to another trend out of COVID, is as you see the shifting demographics and malls closing and ones opening, office becoming obsolete, and yet there's Class A office in some markets is doing fabulously well, very well.
Yeah.
But it gets dragged down because what do you do with 80s office product, right? And same with malls, and just with the shifting demographics, some malls do well and some don't. And then the question is, can you repurpose real estate for another use? And we are most definitely going through that phase. Can you turn a mall into industrial? Can you turn it into a school? Can you turn it into a warehouse? So it's going through property by property and thinking through the creative, and that's what real estate people do. Can you take something and make it better by even taking the shell and making it better? And I think in part, that's some of the evolution that we're going through now. Even off this call, between shifting up and down where people are from vertical integration, right, property management, to shifting industries and segments in the space, to rethinking demographics of where people live, it makes you appreciate that there's a lot going on in this industry, and that's why it's so ripe for opportunity for those who are willing and smart enough to take advantage of it.
Yeah. So what are some of the most, from your chair, your position, what are some of the most innovative things that you've seen your clients or maybe prospects do, people that you're working with?
Yes, and that's a part of the reason I picked on the 3D printing idea as well, is that where I see it going is developers partnering with 3D printing companies to create efficiencies in the production chain. And where that meets is up for debate because it's still new. And what we're seeing too is that's why you're seeing like Lennar partner with Icon, and we will see more of those partnerships as the people who are forward thinking look for ways to create efficiency in the building materials change, which is well overdue for an overhaul as to how we make the materials, how we source them, how we get them to ourselves, and then how we use them. That whole chain is due for some evolution, and I think is probably due for some redevelopment and how do people think about it. And so that I think is most definitely is a super cool chain. And then I think there's other parts of where you are and each element of getting tenants into buildings. I think there's interesting lines there of what we can do. There's smaller efficiencies, smaller companies. There's another piece there. Same with the leasing as I laid out. I think that is also interesting. And you had even talked at the beginning of this program around being able to source, find deals, and partner before they're around. Some of those technologies is, again, it's using AI and using capture grabs from around the world of being able to consolidate information and to be able to use it, right? To be able to use it as long as your output's only as good as your input, but being able to collect massive amount of information and sort through it quicker. Because I think part of if we think about what's underlying all of this, is information is free at this point. You can get it from anywhere. Information's free. Well, okay, you can argue you can pay a subscription for something, but you don't have to go far to find actual information. And because of that, there's so much out there that how do you distill it? How do you use it so that it's to your benefit? And part of that is asking the right questions. If you don't ask the right question, don't be surprised when you don't get your answer, right? But being able to use that filtering system is, I think, is to the benefit of our industry, most definitely. So here's a simple one, and it's been around for a little while now, but when I saw it come through, I thought it was the most amazing piece of technology ever. Scary, but that shopping centers and folks that have managed those shopping centers are able to use technology to learn everything about their potential customer base before they buy a shopping center. And so what could happen is through your phone, which now I turn my phone off with no location, it's that they can tell who comes to a shopping center, where they're shopping in the center, how long they're in an individual store, where they've parked, and then where they go afterwards. They can tell all of that. And you can get that information now, right? But what's really valuable about that from a real estate perspective is before, when you didn't know it, it was a risk. and it's uncertain, right? So you'd have to underwrite that risk and how much of return you need and how much money or the discount rate you have to underwrite before you look at that property. If I've taken that risk out, I don't need as high a return on a risk adjusted basis to get to the exact same place.
Right.
So that changes the dynamics of the industry, if you think about that. And then you can take that concept, and that's been around for a few years now. Imagine what you can do with that if you continue to evolve it, right? And you continue to use it as a way of screening and understanding who your customer base is. I think that's really exciting. And I think those kinds of technologies are filtering throughout the industry in a lot of different ways.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And it is driving down returns. But like you said, if you're removing some of that risk, a large part of that risk, then it's okay. It's appropriate. It becomes more of a bond than it is a speculative or somewhat speculative real estate investment.
Yeah, that would be my argument, because then you can use that information to do all kinds of things with it. It doesn't have to be just on shopping centers. It could be looking at who comes to the kinds of tenants you want in your properties, right? If you knew where those tenants were and how far they're commuting to work, for example, that could help you understand a little bit better as to where you want to put a property and who you think your potential tenant base is. So you can see some extrapolation there as you go through the iteration of that. But it's even like, I think what's happened with which I also think is part of PropTech, is having systems of exchanges, which are very common now, folks being able to access deal flow. I think those things, the crowd, not necessarily has to be the CrowdStreet sites, but in any form of exchange which connects buyers and sellers, is what it's doing is it's giving people access of information to the world, right? And we're having continual more informed buyers, more informed sellers, and greater transparency, which removes some of that friction and some of the risk around the decision making that has historically created a lot of losers in the sector.
Yeah. Yeah. If you think about it, you can get a lot of information from poaching other brokers' information that they put out because they're doing their job to advertise a property and articulate why it's a good opportunity. But in those marketing packages, you've got comp sets, you've got rental competitors, you've got sale competitors, you've got demographics, you've got the P&L, you've got the rent rolls,
Mm-hmm.
all that stuff. And you can learn a lot of information from that. And it's essentially free as long as you have the right email address to access
That's
it.
right. Exactly. See, now you're looking at it the way I am.
Yeah.
But where does that conclusion, where does that ultimately go? It's you end up, there's a concept that you can replace the human manual aspects of day-to-day grinding of numbers and grinding of work. And it puts a greater emphasis on analytics and having an ability to distill information and to synthesize it and figure out what to do with it. That's where your greatest skill and greater benefit happens. And I find for us as a firm, as an advisor, it's I think where we excel and why people come to us is not because for information is free. It's what do you think about this information?
Yeah.
And what should we do with it? And how should it guide what our building of our company and how we're doing our product development and where you think the future is going based on what you've seen and what is available for everybody. And that will be, as the industry continues to mature, it's having those skills that I think end up rising to the top. It used to be you build a model and then you hand over a model and the cash flow is the cash. I think the world has definitely changed in being able to think through what to do with those numbers and how to position so that we have the most benefit.
Yeah, and even you build a model and then it's dated, it's 2 months old. So we got to update it. And that's almost a whole re-underwrite of the deal. Okay. And so if you could potentially find a way to do that in maybe not real time, but shorten the time frame to underwrite a deal and get a turnaround done, that's super powerful.
Yeah.
And you said something earlier about asking those what if questions. And that's exactly what I did with my partners. What if we could use data, the data that's out there, looking at the other platforms, they're like encyclopedias for commercial real estate. If you could use that data and predict real estate transactions And that's what we're on our way to doing. That is what we're doing. So it's very exciting.
Yeah, and look, and here going into COVID, and as we progress through it, just think through the machinations of this, at least for us, in looking at some of what you're doing here. It's that we picked types of industries and types of clients we wanted to work with based on our perspective of what we thought was happening during COVID with people moving, things were winners and who were losers. And for us, we said, okay, with all this information, how do we use it to drive our business? Because if we back the wrong clients in the wrong industry, we don't get any transactions done. We buy and sell companies, right? I can't, or we raise capital. I can't raise capital for that. But how do I know that? I've looked at what has happened in the industry and I look at where I think it is going. And then I say, look, this is where I think the trends are. So these are the kinds of clients that we want to work with. So, like a sector like cold storage, I've liked it for 2 or 3 years now. I think people want everything yesterday. When I go on Amazon, I want something, I want it there that day, or I want it the next day. Why? Because Amazon has told me many times I can have it that day. So now I'm like, what do you mean it's going to take 3 days? I don't want it if it's going to take 3 days because it's too long. But if you think through what that means for sectors like cold storage and industrial outdoor storage, you got to have the facilities closer to the hubs of the consumer because you can't waste days getting it there. And so I think it's really driven. It's one of the pet love spaces right now for institutional investors is cold storage. And part of that is because of this trend coming out of COVID, and there's an emphasis. And so what a lot of people don't appreciate is cold storage it's a difficult sector because there's not a lot of huge players. You've got a couple of big players and then a lot of really small players. It's a big sector. It's hard to rehab because it too fights the technology. How much can you have in a cold storage building in a facility that you can operate automated? They're freezing, right? How much can you use mechanical collection, mechanical automation, mechanical processing to access products? Historically, those buildings didn't have any of that stuff. So can you redo them? Not so easy. But then to do spec, super expensive to build. And we all know how much real estate investors love spec development. Not so much. Are you prepared to get through one of these super expensive facilities on the hope that they will come? But it turns out, yes, the environment has now moved where institutional investors really like the sector because the fundamentals for it are so strong. But then you look around and outside a lot of the big guys, there's a lot of small guys. So it's a question then of how do you align with a good developer, a good owner operator that doesn't have big institutional backing and doesn't have the long dated track record that you ordinarily would need to make an institutional investment. That's where we are. At the same time that you're reading the newspaper about the challenges to the real estate sector, in my world, I see a very super active real estate sector, very super active. And I just picked cold storage, but there's a whole host of them that are just like it, where there's a lot of movement, they're shifting, and there's a lot of innovation development within those sectors that people are trying to figure out how to play it.
Mm-hmm. Well, and it's asking those questions of, all right, what has made this particular deal successful and how can I then replicate that in the next city over or the next market over?
Yes. Yeah.
Fascinating.
Oh, the real estate is a fascinating space. We've had our last couple of years have probably been our two biggest in history. And I think it's in part of just some following the trends, making some judgment calls and figuring out where it's going. And I like manufactured housing similar to you, because I think it's a relic that is long well due for an overhaul. I think there's increasing institutional interest in it. And I think it's just a question of how you play it going forward, because we have a massive housing shortage in this country. And we say that generally, but you have to go market to market. And how do you address that? How do you create a new project so that an average working class family can live in it? Can't do a new construction. It's been very difficult. I think there's some solutions there that we're seeing from some of our clients that I think are going to change the dynamics. And institutional investors, they're not so interested in investing in 60s and 70s and 80s product. How do we solve and address the housing crisis that we have, it is ripe for innovation.
For sure. And I have a friend who runs a manufactured housing brokerage team, and he was explaining underwriting a mobile home park is a little bit science, but a little bit magic too.
A lot more art than science.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And that is a perfect example of an opportunity that if you can wrap your head around the dynamics of a park or of a community and really understand what's driving it, then you can distill it down and figure it out. It just takes a little bit of effort, but you can use some of the tools that are available out there now. I think there's a misnomer that, and I think you touched on it earlier, that and PropTech and all that, it's going to fully replace people and we're just going to be living with the robots. But I think
No.
it's meant to be a tool. It's just like the buggy whip or the slide rule. Like we're
Or
just
the calculator?
yeah, exactly. I have my phone for that, or Excel.
Correct.
They're meant to be tools to help you make better decisions more quickly.
Correct. I completely agree with that. And I think it's similar. And I often use the example of a calculator because the invention, I can't imagine what it was like at that point in time. Oh my gosh, children will never learn math again. But all it is, what it's really done, and this is a general view on AI, what the calculator really did is the simple basic stuff, which is probably not a good use of time, you just don't need to do anymore. And what
Yeah,
does that mean? It frees us up to do more value add stuff, right? So now the advances in math and what the average child can do because of the calculator is pretty extraordinary, right? And it challenges the intellectually curious. It opens doors to go beyond what they thought their capabilities were because they don't have to do some of this basic stuff. And so that's how I look at it, is it just gives us an ability to challenge and go beyond what we thought was capable by not getting bogged down in stuff that doesn't add value.
for sure. And if you think about the human mind and creativity, it's incredible. And if you're not having to be bogged down with the, you might say, lower level machinations of doing like a math problem or something like that, but you can just have it, here's what I want to figure out, then you can use that and lever up to bigger and better things. So I completely agree.
Correct. We get a lot more time to focus on AB calculus and imaginary numbers because we have a calculator, as opposed to focused on doing some of the rudimentary things.
Long
And there's
division.
nothing. Yes. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
But I just want to pick up your comment just on some of the manufactured housing that's in parks, and that I think is a super cool class of real estate too. And it's also another one that is attracting, and probably has for a while, institutional attention. And part of the reason it's struggled, at least from an institutional perspective, is the same with a lot of these niche classes, is that institutions have to put out big volumes of capital because they manage big volumes. So going to them and putting $1 million or $2 million into a deal isn't going to work. They can't get the volume they need. So they end up deferring to larger properties and larger deals. The really, again, a great thing about real estate, because an entrepreneur can go out and start his business, he can go out and do family and friends dollars and buy some property. And if he's good, he can do another one. Then you have a lot. But what happens is when you have a lot and you have a lot of people have a lot of little things, you can roll them together and welcome to institutional wealth, right? Because you can take, but it takes a lot of them. You need a lot of smart entrepreneurs all doing these different things across the country, and they can do them in scale. And then they come to people like us. And so now I've got all these properties and I've got a great portfolio. I've got great returns. But now it's time. How can I create a value and monetize my holdings? And how do I get access to that institutional capital? And that's part of where we come in, because there's also value to, and you should be rewarded for it, that if you've spent the time, effort, and you had the brains and street smarts to roll up all these little assets and create some value in that, you should be paid for that value. So there
Sure.
is value beyond your portfolio of assets. And that's where we can come in too and help you figure out a solution to either grow or exit or monetize and take it to the next level, whatever it is. But I think we're finding that manufactured housing is in this zip code right now. Self-storage gone a little bit out, but that's how student housing become a space. That's how self-storage become a space. It's by doing these and starting off, there's a lot of brilliant people around and taking their brilliance and turning it into something.
Yeah, and allowing for standardization of the data, right? Because it takes it from the guys that are just running it out of their pocket to guys that, okay, let's put it on QuickBooks and then the next iteration, and so let's put it on Yardi or what,
Yes.
pick your accounting
Mm-hmm.
system. But,
Yes.
and then in doing so, that's a value add in and of itself because you're revealing the mysteries of the accounting.
Yeah.
And there you go. You've got
Yeah.
1,000 unit portfolio.
Correct. But it's hard to find these properties. I look at somewhere like at Fort Myers, and I was there last year sometime, and it was actually remarkable how much work still needs to be done and how many homes are displaced. And the news cycle has long passed it, but the people who live there, it has not. And I think that there is so much that can be done there. And both from looking at its modular homes for sure, looking at solutions for apartments and looking at solutions for housing. It is most definitely an area that needs it. And again, on this unaffordable housing, we particularly in the South where you can create projects that are hurricane and flood resistance. Wow, just think there's got to be a solution to that. 3D printing is the way to go. But there is a way that brilliant people can get together and come up with a solution that addresses those needs, because I think technology is ahead of us. We're playing catch up and there's a lot of resistance, but there is definitely ways to keep pushing the envelope by continuing to ask the what if question.
Yeah, and I think I think as the building technologies continue to improve, lenders have sometimes maybe a stigma against modular as they understand it, which
Yeah.
somebody might picture a 60s or 70s vintage mobile home park. But that's
Yeah.
not the modular of today. And so I think maybe it's a marketing campaign or something, but destigmatizing modular as it's not a bad thing. It's probably on par, maybe plus or minus the same cost, but you can get it there that much more quickly. Like you get your foundation set and you just bring it in on a truck, lift it in with a crane, and there you go. You hook up the water and electric. You're good.
Yeah. Look, I think 3D printing's in a place already where it can build your house. I don't know where you live, but the capability is already there. It can design the house across the street from my house. It's already there. And I think the industry in part's been hijacked by folks that think about how cool it would be to live in a donut, right? Because we can, and I'm an engineer, I'm a designer. I think, oh my gosh, that's so amazing. Look what I can do. As opposed to where I am in the industry is I just want to create a product cheaper than a regular apartment so that a family can live in it who is middle class and doesn't have and is already cost constrained to pay rent. That's it. I don't need any bells and whistles. I don't need corduroy walls. I just want to keep it simple, keep it basic so people have a place to call home as an alternative to living in an apartment. That's it. That's here. But now we just got to figure out the cost. The cost isn't quite there yet on making that work, but it is not far off.
Yeah, I think one of the other challenges with this subject is some of the red tape that comes with navigating through cities and their zoning code. I was speaking with somebody here in town, and we own hundreds of lots, and I want to create a standardized building plan, and the community won't let us do it. I want something that I can be like, hey, this fits the majority of the lots that we have.
Mm-hmm.
Let me submit this plan and just stamp it once. And
Yeah.
then I can just keep replicating it out. And it was like, no, sorry, we're not going to do that. And it's, geez, that's such a challenge.
Yeah. And I think in part that comes down to it's which city, which local, which submarket you're in. I've met my fair share of mayors in the South, and a lot of them really are focused on trying to find a way to address affordable housing. They understand the issue is there. And so I think in part it depends on where you are, as with everything, right? It depends on where you are, who you're talking to, whether you have a pre-existing relationship. But the challenges you laid out, I've heard those too. This is new, and so more work needs to be done on working with cities and local and state governments in order to be part of the solution as opposed to getting in the way of coming up with it.
Yeah. I'm curious, when you're talking about 3D printing, when
Mhm.
I think of that, I'm thinking of the concrete that comes out and it just follows a pattern around. Is
Mhm.
that what you're referring to, or are
Yeah,
there
but
other
it doesn't have to be,
techniques?
no, that's it, but it doesn't have to be concrete. There's other alternatives that are using now. And often we see 3D printing in pictures with that corduroy with the lines.
Right.
It doesn't need to be that way. It can actually look like an Adobe house. And it's actually easier to do it that way. And it doesn't have to have round corners. It really can just look like a regular house. Those systems are there. You can print in the cabinets, you can do bathrooms, and the designs is a little up to how you want it to look and what the feel and touch is. But the concepts that I can't design my houses that's across the street, I think we're there.
That's fascinating.
It's very fascinating. But like I said, I mean, there's a lot of smaller companies, but that are looking at cracking through and figuring out how to grow and how to create it. I think it will get there. But I remember when student housing was not really an industry, and the conversation around bed bath parity was like, bed bath parity? What do you mean we're going to put two bathrooms in an apartment with just two bedrooms? Who does that? Look at where we are. And look how that industry has completely turned into what we have today. It's all these, every industry started somewhere outside of our four food groups, which we all know what they are, but everything else is niche. And this is today, it is the world of niche. There is niche.
Yeah.
So today, if you're going to ask about apartment buildings, the first question should be, what do you mean by that?
Right.
When you're talking about an apartment, what do you mean? Are you talking about housing? What do you mean by that? If you think through single family homes and you can have scattered site and you're built to rent the communities, the build to rent communities, that's new. That's a new concept. I remember we were pitching that a decade ago and no one was listening to us because it was not institutional back then. Now, more than 10 years ago. But now it's an institutional product where you can design communities to rent. But think through the technology involved in what was before scattered site and the systems you need to manage a house there. It's crazy the kind of tech systems behind to manage that kind of product. So there's another a tech that's ripe to manage the scattered site. But when people talk about single family homes, again, it should be, what do you mean by that? And I think increasingly so, we're getting much more micro in how we talk about even basic forms of real estate. And so that the entrepreneur who used to hold their finger in the air and say, I can make money off that piece of dirt. It's now the world is so far gone past that. And I think, again, it's endless possibilities of the ways we can redesign and build and change and create these products.
Yeah, you're right. It's how specifically are you going to do it? Are you going to build a market rate deal? Is it affordable housing? Is it senior housing? Is it age and income restricted senior housing? Is it maybe B plus class housing? Is it a build to rent community? Like you've got a 20-acre parcel. There's millions of things you could do with it, millions of iterations out of those basic food groups that you mentioned.
Correct. And so, look, active adult living is a new space that's relatively new. It's the newest of all the senior housing, which is in some ways, it's a bit of a mix between market rate and senior and co-living and all these spaces. But what they all have in common, it's amenitized spaces, super, super amenitized space for seniors. How do you make the economics work? That's the next question. But look, I also remember a time since I've been around in real estate where it was a case of, well, we were trying to look at smaller micro units, highly amenitized spaces, but with smaller units. And the dollar per square foot on the unit then is super high, right? Because you're outsourcing into the amenitized space. I remember going to institutional investors trying to raise capital, first deal out. They're like, there's no way. There's no way someone will rent that apartment at that rent at the dollar per square foot. I'm like, really? And here we fast forward today. Can you imagine a world that doesn't have amenitized spaces for apartments? It's like, it's the standard today. It's the total standard. But I remember having those conversations around changing the unit size, making them smaller on the basis that the next generation doesn't always live in their apartment. They sleep
Right.
there, but they're social creatures. They want convenience, but they're social creatures. And so we need to design and rethink what the spaces look like that they live in. Now it's a lot more common. There's a lot of players that do it now, but amenities, everyone talks about amenities. 10, 15 years ago, I don't think that was the case at all.
Yeah. You can get, I think, a super efficient unit that's got built-ins and things like that, almost maybe a Murphy bed or something like, but you can
Yeah,
get real cozy with a unit if it's super well thought out and highly efficient in the design. And then you have a larger, maybe community workspace that you can
correct.
direct people to go. They're not going to just want to be in their unit 24/7. They want to be able to go out and take advantage of the community space. And I think that the repurposing of office buildings provides some opportunities with that, because if you think about office, you've got these long, if you're chopping them up into units, typically you've got long, skinny apartments. So
Mm-hmm.
it's okay, you could do that. But then if you are maybe cramming in units or efficiently planning your floor plans, then you can have a whole lower floor that doesn't have the great views, perhaps, and use that as space for workout facility or shared workspace or whatever it is. And that can be a much larger open area, but it combines those two worlds. And I think that's a good
Yeah,
opportunity in the
yeah,
changing of the real estate space.
I agree. And so if I circle back around to where we started, where I was talking about we've been very busy and we have a big M&A group, that's in part because as the world changes in real estate, investment managers, which is a big chunk of our client base, is they are looking for teams and groups and products and other fund managers that broaden beyond what they're doing. And they too are looking for ways to capture where the world is changing, right? For an owner, operator, developer, it's at the project level. But for a big fund manager, it's maybe I want a vehicle that just does cold storage. Maybe I wanted to do just data centers. Maybe I wanted to do battery storage. And there's all these offshoots now, and you're seeing the whole concept of a diversified fund is a little bit gone by the side water there. And it's become much more specialized. So you have specialized sleeves for things. And that's part of the reason we've been so busy. It's that these fund managers are also looking for ways to expand their business. And the easiest way, you either do it through product, geography, or distribution. And so a lot of them are looking at product. How can we expand the number of products we have? And how do we rethink the products we're offering? And maybe I can create two products out of my one product offering by addressing some niches, going down the standard path with this other piece, and do it that way. So there's a lot of things you can do, chop and swap and replace and move around, with all of them focused of how do I just take my business to the next level. And all this stuff that's gone at the property level ends up rising up to that level is with the institutions to try and figure out how to play the trends that are coming forward to grow their own businesses.
This is amazing. I feel like we could talk for hours. This is a fascinating
I
subject.
know. Isn't it great? I love
Yeah.
this stuff. This stuff is great.
Yeah. Me too. Deb, if somebody wants to get in touch with you to talk about your services, either legacy planning or M&A, trying to build or grow what they have, what's the best way to reach you?
Sure. You can, I'm on LinkedIn. You can find me, StashCast Deborah Smith on LinkedIn there. We have a website. My email address and my contact info is on both. So you can reach out to me there. And I'm always happy to have a conversation. There's lots going on. But more importantly, if I think a good idea has merit, I'm the first to say so. And I'm also the first to say if I don't. If I don't think it has merit.
Perfect.
I'm
Perfect.
happy to let you know that I'm not sure I'm the right advisor for you.
Yeah, you've got to, like you said, you've got to be specialized. So that's good.
Got to specialize. We're all trying to figure out how to take advantage and how to grow our businesses. And it's an exciting time to be in real estate.
For sure. Absolutely.
Sure.
Thank you so much for joining us today. And I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Same to you. Thanks for having me on.